Tengo para mostrarles hoy una conferencia que hizo Skinner, y pues en cierta manera como lo que él plantea en su conferencia es la manera como él, digámoslo así, como defiende el conductismo, como él argumenta por qué es importante todo lo que tiene que ver con el condicionamiento, la contingencia, las consecuencias, el reforzamiento. Entonces, vamos a iniciar con esta conferencia que es ya muy viejita, inclusive está en blanco y negro, para que miremos, digámoslo de una manera resumida, todo lo que hemos trabajado en este módulo en estos días de lo de las técnicas operantes, de lo de los reforzadores y toda esta cuestión. Él nos los va a argumentar. Y inclusive una de las críticas que él se le hacían era de que él había educado o había criado a las hijas como si fueran, que se las había colocado en una caja de Skinner. Entonces, él responde a esas preguntas, ¿no? Pero hizo ver de qué manera pues se generan esos procesos de aprendizaje y de condicionamiento. Entonces, vamos a comenzar con ello. Luego, creo yo que nos vamos a demorar en este primer corte que vamos a demorarnos viendo esta conferencia para luego en el segundo corte ver otro video que ya es más como una situación de lo cotidiano, de lo real, de las pautas de crianza, de las sanciones, los castigos que se presentan en algunas casas, el manejo que le hacen, ¿no? Y a quién acuden. Entonces, digamos que eso sería como el segundo video. Y luego ya entramos a analizarlos, vamos a hablar con respecto a eso y bueno, los escucharé con respecto a sus opiniones. Entonces, permítanme, voy a comenzar con la conferencia de Skinner. Permítanme. No, perdón, no la tengo. No me pico. Un momento, por favor. Listo. Vamos a comenzar.
Buenas tardes, profe.
Hola, ¿cómo estás? Buenas tardes. Tardes, noches. Bueno.
People was in the field of verbal behavior, and I still think that's true. I got around to doing a book on verbal behavior 20 years later, published in 1957, but it doesn't simply mean that animals suddenly start talking and that's all there is to it. The essential thing is that once verbal behavior became possible, and I think that was due to an evolutionary process that brought the vocal musculature under what I would call operant control, call it voluntary control if you like. Up to that point it had been associated with instinctive cries and so on. But once that became possible to put it crudely, to use speech to be effective, to produce results, then you could have a culture emerge in which people began to ask each other, what are you doing, why are you doing that? In other words, they began to set up the conditions that led people to look at their own behavior and look at themselves and their own bodily processes when they were behaving. I regard consciousness, awareness, as a social product. I can't imagine how the individual would ever become a conscious individual unless there were other people to provide the contingencies that lead him or her to ask questions of that nature. Many people have said, well, how does the behaviors deal with the unconscious? Well, that's easy. All behavior begins as unconscious behavior, but some of it becomes conscious when you look at it, analyze it, look at the external conditions under which this behavior occurs, look at the states of your body with which you are in contact. These you call your feelings, your states of mind, and you are then able to talk about these things. Now, a very large part of a culture which makes it so helpful and enables the individual to do so much more as a member of a culture than would be possible as a single individual has to do with making use of the experience of other people. You give someone advice. Now, what does that mean? You yourself have been in contact with some situation, and by describing what you do and the results you get, another person can avoid all of the exploratory behavior which led to that discovery. For example, if you just arrived in Miami, you might find a good restaurant through a process of just going and eating here, 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 and here, until finally you find one which happens to be the kind of restaurant you like. But if you know someone who knows your tastes, that person can say, if you like good Italian food, go to Luigi's. I don't know whether there is a Luigi, so I'm not really puffing anybody up here. That sentence contains two things. One, a description of behavior, go to a restaurant, and another one, some kind of reference to a reinforcing consequence. Go to that restaurant and you will get a good Italian meal. Now, once that has happened, you don't need to bother going all over Miami till you find a good Italian restaurant. And that's a very useful thing. The advice that one person gives another, the warnings one gives another, the maxims and proverbs, which are sort of general kinds of advice that a culture can develop, these become extremely important. And I've argued, and I think I've convinced myself, that governmental and scientific laws are of this nature. They describe behavior and its consequences, and hence can be used instead of the kind of shaping behavior that have to go on otherwise. Someone has said it's rather ridiculous if to shape the behavior of a person as you shape the behavior of a rat or a pigeon, when you can simply tell a person what to do. If I wanted to get a chimpanzee, for example, to pull the plunger of a vending machine, I know how I would do it. I could shape that behavior fairly quickly, and the chimp would learn to pull the plunger and get a bit of something edible. But if it were a person, I could simply say, pull the plunger and you'll get the pack of cigarettes or whatever it is that's going to come out. The instruction on the vending machine, pull plunger and press button under a pack of cigarettes, these are instructions, they're advice, and it saves you the trouble of fumbling around with all of the equipment and the whole environment until finally you find something which produces a pack of cigarettes. And that is, of course, extraordinarily valuable. It does not mean that there's something wrong with the process of shaping behavior, because until you have acquired the behavior of following instructions, nothing else is available. And that is why, with animals, that's about all you have. You can teach animals an imitative repertoire, so you can teach a new response by giving an imitative model. It's very difficult to do, but you do it. And we do it with children. We used verbal descriptions of contingencies and imitative modeling, so that the child watching someone get something immediately knows what to do. But that doesn't come free. It's only after the child has learned to imitate that is possible. So that you don't avoid the essential shaping process in the first place. Now, the cognitive psychology, on the point I made this morning, is concerned with the way you talk about contingencies, the way you give reasons for doing things. And when I say, if you want a good Italian dinner, go to Luigi's, I give you reasons why you should go to Luigi's, because you get a good dinner when you do that. And this kind of thing is, of course, very commonly done, and it is the rational side of human behavior. But Freud saw what was wrong with that. I can say to a person, pull the plunger and you get his pack of cigarettes. But supposing this person is ruining himself gambling, and I say to him, okay, Tim, I can give you some very good advice, stop gambling. That's that. I give you reasons for stop gambling. If you stop gambling, you won't lose money. So you stop. Yes, but you don't. You see, the contingencies are more powerful there than the reasons. Now, the reasons are descriptions of the contingencies, but you don't have reasons to follow the reasons. And so you go right on gambling. And that's a problem that therapists face. You can give a patient reasons for behaving well, but that isn't enough, as Freud was very clearly pointed this out. Freud would say with the unconscious reasons, by unconscious reasons, all he means, all I would mean, and if I said the same thing, is that there are reinforcing contingencies, mostly reinforcing consequences, which are strengthening behavior in opposition to what appear to be the reasons that society gives you for behaving in a given way. As you know that if you want to get along better with your wife, you should stop nagging, or should stop complaining, stop this, that, and so on. All right. Those are reasons, and probably they're correct. On the other hand, it's terribly reinforcing to you to find that she's wrong at this, and complain about this, and complain about that, and so on. So that is what you do. There are reinforcing consequences to determine the behavior. The reasons given aren't enough. And I think the main problem, really, in therapy, it seems to me one of the problems in face-to-face therapy with just not a psychotic, but with a neurotic person, is to find the contingencies of reinforcement, which are the troublemaking effects, so that good reasons, which are descriptions of better contingencies, can actually work. Well, that's my explanation of the difference between animals and people. People do talk about what they're doing. They talk about the world in which they live, the contingencies that affect them, and they try to influence each other by describing contingencies. In other words, by giving reasons rather than by reinforcing. Now, I would say that the behavior modifier has discovered that in many cases the reasons won't do it, and that you then work on the contingencies of reinforcement. This would be particularly true of psychotics and retarded people who aren't actually able to respond to reasons. The descriptions of contingencies don't get through to them. Neither do contingencies very often. That's why you have to have very conspicuous reinforcers, such as a token economy. If that works, it works. Of course, you want to get rid of the conspicuous reinforcer as soon as you can. But this whole difference between contingency shaped behavior and rule-governed behavior, which is the rational kind of thing, where you talk about the contingencies and change people because they can learn from the experience of others by following rules, is I think, essentially the difference between a narrow conception of behavior modification and a narrow conception of what cognitive psychology is all about. I would argue that the cognitive processes are also behavioral, and there's no reason to make that distinction. Well, that was, I think, covers several of the questions that have been raised here. I want, since my charming daughter is here, I want to answer one other question right away. It's called a personal question here, person with a question mark after the personal. Would you describe in what way your children were involved with the Skinner box? That means the so-called air crib, not the lever pressing box. Did you use some principles of behavior analysis to raise your children? What was the outcome? Well, I welcome this question because I like to correct some rumors that go around. I don't know, I'm sure that some of you have heard them. a distinguished psychiatrist, whose name you all know, I won't mention it, told a distinguished person, whose name you also would know, that the child that we raised in the so-called box, the air crib, became psychotic. I wrote to him, I said, we've heard this before, I've often wondered where it came from. Would you mind telling me where you heard this rumor? Our daughter is very intelligent, talented, married. Her husband teaches international studies at the University of Warwick. They live in London and Leamington Spa. My daughter is a very successful artist. She does large colored etchings and sells all she can produce and so on. I don't see any ill effects of the crib on her. Well, he wrote a very apologetic letter, I must say that. He didn't tell me where he heard it. Then one summer, a British critic came over and said to a friend of ours, a professor of literature at Harvard, isn't it too bad about that daughter of the Skinners they raised in the box killing herself? And our friend said, well, when did she do that? I was swimming with her yesterday. But recently I've been getting letters. I've had 2 or 3 in the last month. Is it true that your daughter is suing you? I wish to say, that's the daughter who's not here. I can't put her on display, but she's not suing me. We have a very good relationship, as a matter of fact. As to using behavior modification, it's very curious. I look back on it now. I never did use any kind of contrived reinforcing contingencies on my children, nor are there any in Walden 2. It's a very curious thing, I think. Walden 2 was written 7 years after the publication of The Behavior of Organisms, published 10 years after. It was the application of the principles that I thought I had discovered to the design of a culture. But the reinforcing contingencies in the culture are all natural. In fact, there's a very strong trend against contrived ones. You don't ever say thank you in Walden 2. That's a contrived reinforcer, you see. And that was true with my children. I never had a token economy. I never had a gold star point system, anything of that sort. The only exception with my younger daughter, Deborah, I did twice shape a bit of behavior through the use of a reinforcer. Once when she was about 7 or 8 months old, I was sitting in the living room holding her on my lap and playing with her and having fun. The room was getting dark, and I reached up and turned on a lamp. And she smiled, and I thought, a reinforcer. So I thought I would just see if I could use it. So I turned the light off, and I waited for her until she lifted her left hand a little bit, and I turned the light on immediately. And then turned it off, and she lifted it again. Pretty soon she was doing this to make the light go on. And a few years later, a man named Fuller did the same thing with a 20-year-old vegetative idiot in the hospital, found that this creature had never shown any sign of intelligence for 20 years, but by using the bottle that it ate from in the same way, got this vegetative idiot to do the same thing. So my daughter at least contributed to the improvement in the lives of vegetative idiots. Anyway, when she was 4 or 5 years old, I was telling her a bedtime story, rubbing her back. I was sitting on the edge of her bed, rubbing her back. And I thought, well, this is reinforcing. I'll see what I can do with this. So I waited until she lifted a foot, and I rubbed her back, and I stopped. Lifted her foot again, and I rubbed her back. Then she gave a great kick and started to laugh. I said, what are you laughing at? She said, when I lift my foot, you rub my back. She had advanced from the animal to the human stage by that time. She could talk about the contingencies of reinforcement, and did. And both my daughters would say to me, don't use your psychology on us. And I never actually did. So they turned out well for perhaps the wrong reasons. Let me see. There are some very, very good questions here. I haven't organized them in any. There's one question here about why is it that almost every therapeutic approach, regardless of theoretical orientation, seems to produce some success. This is one of the frustrating things, I think, about theories of psychotherapy. If you're really enthusiastic, it doesn't much matter, especially if it's your own theory. That's the main thing. It works. And this isn't misrepresentation. It's not cheating. I think a patient who has the good luck to fall into the hands of someone who's just discovered a new theory of psychotherapy is a very lucky patient, because you'll get all kinds of very warm attention and so on. I don't know. I can't analyze and try to find the invariance in such a situation, but it would certainly have something to do with the heightened personal attention that a person gives the therapist gives to a patient when a theory is at issue. And I suspect that is it. That what the actual reinforcers are that are operating, I would hesitate to guess. Then there's one here about operant conditioning avoids the question of motivation by claiming that it is a function of a previous history of positive reinforcement. But why and at what point do individual organisms begin to respond differently to different reinforcers? That's a very, very hard question to answer, of course. For one thing, when you start to deal with a human organism, let's say at the age of 1, let alone the age of 21 or 41, with an enormous history that you can only guess at, things that have happened. And under those conditions, I don't know what you can do except make the best guess as to what has probably happened from some sort of a survey, some way of finding out what has actually been going on. The basic reinforcers of the human organism are due, I assume, like those of all species, to survival value. That doesn't mean that they are necessarily good. I would like to make a great deal of the fact that we are out of date with respect to our current environment, in the sense that we tend to be reinforced by things which no longer need to be that reinforcing for the sake of the survival of the species. Sugar and salt would be examples of this. Until fairly recently, there was very little sugar and salt in the environments of human beings, except in the case of salt, those who lived in Miami and on the ocean. But the species had to have these substances. Sugar sweetness was associated with ripe fruit, and that was about all. And salt, the salt lick that animals go to, a great danger to themselves and so on, show you how important it is to be reinforced by salt on the tongue. And until salt was mined and processed and put on every table in salt cellars and on potato chips and all sorts of things like that, it was important that people ate a certain amount of salt. Same thing is true of sugar. Until the discovery of sugar cane and sugar beets and the processing and storage and sale of sugar and the ubiquitous candy counter and so on, it was important that people be reinforced by sugar, because if you run on something nutritious and it tastes sweet, it's good to remember where you got it and how to get it again and so on. However, now, of course, these things are so terribly reinforcing that we overeat both of them and get overweight or destroy the chemical balance in the body. Same thing is true of sexual reinforcement. At a time when the species was decimated by famine, pestilence, and and wars and so on, it was important that human beings copulated every opportunity. And the way that evolved was to make sex extraordinarily reinforcing. Well, now we're overpopulating the world because it is so reinforcing. These are things which we've changed, but the world has changed, and we no longer need to be this susceptible. Now you can say, well, thank God they are that reinforcing, and you can use contraceptives and saccharin and artificial salt and so on, and enjoy. But it is a great problem, and the world is suffering from the survival of a feature of the human organism which is no longer appropriate. I think probably signs of aggressive damage would be one of those too. That if you are in a world where you survive only if you fight well, then any sign that you've hurt someone is a very good thing, because you learn to fight well if somebody groans or cries out and so on when you hit him just right. And I dare say there's some tendency to be reinforced when people are hurt. And we find that all the way from Schadenfreude and all the way down to watching professional football. But anyway, these are the basic reinforcers. Of course, they then are almost immediately overlaid with conditioned reinforcers, the things that eventually get these things for you. What the mother does to the baby is associated with nursing and sweet milk and so on, makes whatever the mother does reinforcing. And there's an elaborate set of reinforcers built up there. The social reinforcers, they come from people who treat you well, and also the negative ones who treat you badly. These are the things that you acquire. But what an individual has acquired in a lifetime, when he comes for, say, therapy at the age of 30 or something of that sort, that I see no way of ever finding that out so that you could actually make use of the facts. What you can do is to make a current survey of what seems to be reinforcing to this person, and I don't regard that as circular. One of the questions here is it true that the whole idea of reinforcement is circular? Something is reinforcing because it reinforces. And that's about correct. I think you find out what is reinforcing by seeing whether it increases the probability of behavior upon which it is contingent. I mean, that's no more circular than talking about ferrous metals being magnetic and brass not. What is a magnetic? Well, it's something that responds to magnetism, and brass doesn't, and irons do, then circular perhaps, but still a very useful concept. And if you define a reinforcer as something which makes behavior more probable when it is contingent upon the behavior, then that's an observational kind of thing. It is not, I think, basically circular. I think I've answered that one essentially. Following the publication of About Behaviors in 1974, there was criticism regarding the lack of sufficient philosophical foundation. And the question goes on from that a little further. Philosophers have raised the question about my philosophical sophistication. I can't point to any elaborate education in philosophy, but I believe that this could be said also, let us say, of the logical positivists who did have a great education in the history of philosophy. There are some points of view which more or less invalidate the whole domain of philosophical inquiry. I used an example this morning of that sort in my lecture. You can teach a pigeon to name a single property of an object. You have some panels with colors printed on them, and then are some objects here, and if the object is white, no matter what its shape or size, the pigeon pecks the word white, and if it's red, but no matter what the size or shape, it pecks the word red, and so on. And I had a quotation from Karl Popper. Does this mean that there is an essential property of whiteness, or do we collect a set in terms of that, or there's an alternative expression I won't go into, but there are complicated philosophical statements of what is going on with respect to the essence of an abstract term of that sort. Well, the contingencies are perfectly obvious, and I insist that the contingencies suffice to explain the behavior not only of the pigeon, but of ourselves. When we have singled out separate properties of objects and identify them with terms. Now, it may look as if I were unsophisticated and unaware of all the discussion that's gone on for 2,500 years about invariance and essences and whatnot, but I'm not. Yes, I am. I'm ignorant of that because I've lost interest in it. But the contingencies of reinforcement provide an alternative that seem to me to be much simpler and certainly much closer to a scientific account of the behavior. Sass and others have said that behaviorism is reductionistic and dehumanizes man. As I've pointed out, it dehomunculizes man. If you believe that the body is steered and run by a little man inside, then behaviorism gets rid of that little man. The body is run by its own structure, the genetic endowment of the species, and its history and contact with the environment and the current environment. I think that that is compatible with the most noble view of human nature. I see no dehumanizing about it. The thing that bothers me about these references to behaviorism as being manipulative, and another question brought that up, is this. Chomsky and others have repeatedly said that behaviorism is associated with manipulative political philosophies, by which he means, I suppose, fascism.
Profe,
And as a matter of fact, I have been
es que...
fascist.
Ah, no, ya, es que la parte de abajo no se alcanzaba a leer, pero ya. Se le ha como cortado el video.
Similar to what's happened under what I would call fascist governments. The issue is this: if you think that human behavior is determined primarily by genetic programming, and this is what you mean when you talk about the development of human behavior. Shakespeare had 7 ages, Erik Erikson has 10, Freud had different ones depending upon when you look at Freud's work and so on, but there are things are growing in the individual. You're born with a knowledge of grammar according to Chomsky and so on. You know the rules of grammar. If you think that we develop, in a sense of grow, like an embryo, and Chomsky has said, Roger Brown has said that the development of language is like embryonic growth, then you're at one end of the continuum. At the other end, you say that behavior is due to what happens during the lifetime of the individual. You don't deny that you start with an organism, and that is genetic, but it is pliable, manipulable, you can change it. Then, quite clearly, in that case, manipulation is at the end of the environmental end of the continuum. Because you can change the environment, you can't change the genetic endowment except very slowly through some kind of genetic program. And nobody pays much attention to eugenics these days or any kind of effort. You can't make people speak grammatically by breeding people with better innate grammar. It don't work that way. If you want to teach people to be grammatical, you teach better grammar in schools. Well, if those are the two ends, then you ask which is going to be the one politically most associated with, let's say, vicious political practices. Well, I submit that if you know how to change the environment and are concerned with things like education, therapy, and so on, you will use those ways to bring about the kinds of changes that are important. If you, on the other hand, don't, if you believe this thing is all born into you, then you can't change in any reasonable way at all, and you turn into the most violent ways. The person who really believed in the genetic programming of behavior in the 20th century was Adolf Hitler. That's racism. And Chomsky is absolutely 180 degrees wrong about this. It isn't that racism follows, that it isn't that the concentration camp follows from a theory of innate behavior. It is that when you believe that behavior is innate, you can't think of anything else to do but a final solution which involves a concentration camp. When you are concerned about changing behavior and can do so, then you don't turn to the vicious methods. You turn to better schools, better forms of therapy, better incentive systems, better rehabilitation programs, and so on. So I would say just the opposite from Chomsky, that a good practical behavior modification makes it possible to be humane in dealing with people, whereas the genetic approach leaves you open to nothing but violence. I'm sure that my so-called friend, Dr. Thomas Sass, would not agree with that. He is a is the ultimate in a rightist, but also, curiously enough, would believe in the individual as determining his own behavior. Well, that is a form of genetic determination, of course. Well, I don't know whether I should try to probe these anymore. But could I just throw it open to the audience to, if you've asked a question I haven't answered, please bring it up.
Bien, hay muchas cosas que allí nos estaba planteando Skinner con respecto a cómo el conductismo, digámoslo, ha sido siempre cuestionado como esa relación mecanicista, esa relación simplista de la conducta consecuente. Pero que en últimas, pues, él lo explicaba allí, de cómo nosotros estamos generando procesos de aprendizaje, procesos de condicionamiento a cada instante. Y eso se ve inclusive en lo cotidiano. Él daba el ejemplo y hacía referencia a cómo nosotros cuando observamos una máquina que nos da una cajetilla de cigarrillo, lo que hacemos nosotros es presionar un botón. Ahí vemos nosotros cómo se ha generado un tipo de estímulo generalizado, un estímulo que me permita a mí saber qué es lo que voy a oprimir. Ahí se habla inclusive de la contingencia, ahí se habla del refuerzo, porque yo cuando coloco la moneda, oprimo, estoy haciendo unas asociaciones y espero obtener el refuerzo, que en este momento sería la cajetilla de cigarrillo. Y eso era lo que le criticaban al conductismo. Por eso el conductismo está involucrado en cada uno de los aspectos de nuestra vida cotidiana. ¿Ven? Y cuando le decían de que por qué las cosas con el conductismo se estaba deshumanizando al ser humano con todos estos procesos, y él planteaba de que, o planteó de que el objetivo de nosotros los seres humanos, pues en cierta manera es generar cambios comportamentales, y que dependiendo del entorno en donde estemos nosotros, el entorno nos puede cambiar, el contexto puede cambiar o generar una modificación conductual. ¿Ven? Me parece importante entender de que en la visión humanista del ser humano, esa visión humanista, porque lo que queremos siempre nosotros es siempre mejorar, es tener una mejor calidad de vida, y si el medio ambiente que teníamos antes no me lo permite, pues entonces la idea es de que se generen nuevos estímulos, nuevos procesos de aprendizaje, nuevas respuestas, siempre con el propósito de mejorar, siempre con el propósito de hacerme la vida mucho más amena, mucho más agradable. Y ahí no estamos deshumanizando a la persona, por el contrario, estamos buscando que se mejore, que cambie, que vea que esto no le sirve y que sí le puede servir. Ya vamos a terminar en este primer corte, entonces ya nos volvemos a ver y continúo hablando de lo que nos estaba planteando Steven. Ya nos volvemos a ver.